Hello there, my college students. It's good to be with you. I wish I could be there with you physically to discuss and introduce the readings for this week, but we're going to try a little PowerPoint with voiceover here. I'm hoping by now you received my rather lengthy email on Friday that contains kind of our plan going forward as well as our plan for this week. In addition to viewing this particular PowerPoint video, you should also probably print or have available to you the chart, the graphic organizer. I think I called it the Synoptic Gospels graphic organizer on Moodle, as well as the Infancy Narratives worksheet, which has a chart on it that you're going to complete for your own purpose, for your own benefit, I should say, as you read through the early chapters of a couple of the Gospels. So, what I hope to do in the next 5 or 7 minutes as we watch, as you listen to the video here, is to introduce Matthew, Mark, and Luke and their styles and their background so that as you start to get into the Gospels this week, you'll have some skills kind of to be able to unpack and do some of the redaction criticism on your own. The question here of what no John, John is not considered a synoptic gospel. John's gospel is vastly different from what we see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke in terms of structure and style. And so perhaps periodically in a future video, I will make for you a comment or two about John, but primarily our focus is going to be Mark's gospel with a few kind of side views to Matthew and Luke with some things that they have in their gospels that are unique. So to introduce them to you, our first synoptic gospel is Mark. Mark is probably historically a figure by the name of John Mark. John Mark, we are told in the Acts of the Apostles, which is a book in the New Testament after John's Gospel that describes the history of the early church. John Mark is one of the folks that we meet in that particular text, and he's described as a friend of Peter and a traveling companion of Paul. Paul being obviously the one who goes out and networks all those Christian communities together through the writings of the letters, and Peter being the leader of the early church. So he probably was a firsthand eyewitness to. So Mark was a traveling companion of Paul and a friend of Peter. So whether or not he knew Jesus firsthand, or certainly had firsthand access to the apostles and Paul and the early leaders of the church to get his information from in compiling his gospel, is probably where it comes from. We believe that he's written his gospel somewhere in the 65 to 70 AD, and we're pretty sure these are accurate dates because he's writing a gospel that makes no mention of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which was a major issue that confronted the Jews in the early 70s AD when they tried to revolt against the Romans. It is mentioned in some of the other gospels that are written after, but there is no mention of it in Mark's gospel, so it leads us to believe that it was written just prior to the destruction of the temple again in the late 60s AD. His primary audience, again, all the Gospels were written for one particular audience, though they were often shared and passed to other communities as well. Mark's primary audience was for a group of persecuted Gentile Christians living in Rome. A couple of key words here. The word Gentile means non-Jewish, so this is a community that's predominantly not Jewish in terms of its background. And they are a community being persecuted by the Roman emperor. So, think of all the historical information that you might know about the Romans persecuting, feeding Christians to the lions, hiding in the catacombs, and all that business. These are the folks that Mark is targeting in his gospel. And that doesn't surprise us then that in his gospel, suffering is going to be kind of the number one ingredient to be a faithful disciple of Jesus. You'll see on the later slides, I'm going to pose the question that if we were to ask the evangelist, what's the number one thing you need to do to be a faithful disciple of Jesus? Kind of that one word or one phrase answer for each. For Mark, it's to suffer. And I think that's very much relevant to who his audience is, that this is a group of people who are being persecuted because of their belief in Jesus. And so when Jesus says things in Mark's gospel, like take up your cross and follow me, not only within the context of the overall gospel is that a powerful kind of directive of Jesus, but it speaks to the heart of what Mark's primary audience, his primary community, is experiencing. Mark's gospel also is going to give us the most human portrait of Jesus. We see a lot of human emotions. We see passages, you will see passages where Jesus is described in a very kind of limited and finite sort of way. Some of that gets cleaned up in the later versions of the gospels. But again, it's something that his audience, Mark's audience, would have been able to identify with. Here is a Messiah who clearly suffers, who's clearly limited, who clearly understands the human condition. Again, more to come on Mark's style in a separate PowerPoint next week. Our next gospel is Matthew, and we have here to the right of your screen the famous picture by Caravaggio of the calling of St. Matthew. You see Jesus in the kind of shadows there pointing out to Matthew, the tax collector, sitting at the table making that who me gesture. And so what do we know about Matthew that we want to keep in mind as we read the gospel? The first thing is it's attributed to the apostle Matthew, though I have a question mark there because we don't believe that the actual tax collector Matthew identified in the Gospels is the actual author of the text. Reason being, again, the Gospels written around 80 to 85 AD, so we're talking a good 50 years after Jesus, and if Matthew as a tax collector would have been close in age to Jesus, then presumably he would be 80 or 85 years old, and people didn't live to be that old back at that point in history. So more than likely, it is probably a follower of Matthew from the Gospel, somebody who wanted to attribute authorship over to him. His sources, where did he get his information from? We saw with Mark that he had access to Peter and Paul. What we know about Matthew's information was that he used Mark. When you're reading Matthew's Gospel, you're reading a good percentage of Mark because it's the same information. He also used something that is called a Q source. You're going to hear more about Q source on the next slide with Luke. Q source is a common source used by both Matthew and Luke. We don't know what it is. We don't know if the Q source is a lost gospel. We don't know if the Q source was an early manuscript or a journal of the kinds of sayings that Jesus did. We just know that there's some information that is word for word matching between Matthew and Luke that did not come from Mark but had to have come from another common source. Then the M by itself there, the third source, that's stuff that's unique to Matthew, whether that was from Matthew the tax collector or whether that was part of an oral tradition within Matthew's community. We're not really sure, but there's stuff that's unique to him as well. His audience was a group of Jewish Christians living in Syria. It is the only gospel that is written for a predominantly Jewish Christian community. You might see that again maybe on a quiz later this week. For him, if you were to ask, what does it mean to be a disciple? His answer would be a good Jew. Do all the things that good Jewish people did during Jesus's day. Follow the commandments, go to synagogue, go to temple, be God-fearing and faithful, and things will turn out okay for you. He's going to emphasize, no surprise, Jesus as a kind of model Jew. Jesus very often comes across in Matthew's gospel as kind of a rabbi, a teaching figure, an authority figure who's going to teach about how to be a good and faithful Jew. Matthew will also make several opportunities in his gospel to draw parallels between Jesus and the great heroes of the Jewish scriptures, whether that's making parallels to Moses and the infancy narratives or quoting prophecies from the Old Testament that seem to point to Jesus as the Messiah. An additional question that I posed here, and you can put it on the bottom of your graphic organizer for the three synoptic gospel writers, is why is Matthew put first in the canon, the order of the New Testament, if it wasn't written first? Three answers here. One is it was the most popular. If we go back and look at the historical records of the first 100 years or so of the church, it was Matthew's gospel that had the widest circulation. Again, written for one community, but passed on beyond there. It also is the smoothest transition from Old Testament to New. So if you were reading the Bible book by book, chapter by chapter, when you finish the books of the prophets in the Old Testament and turn the page to the New, it would make a very smooth transition in terms of the writing style. Third, it's the easiest to read and understand. That might contribute back to its popularity in the early church. It seems as though Matthew's gospel was used as kind of a textbook in the early church to help early Christians know what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Third, we get to Luke. Luke's gospel. Hey, where'd that picture come from? No, not that Luke. This Luke. This gospel writer is a traveling companion of Paul, a physician, we're told, in the Acts of the Apostles, and also a Gentile. So he is probably the only gospel writer who is named, the person whose name is on the gospel, and is also a Gentile. His source is very much like Matthew. He gets a lot of his material from Mark that he borrows word for word, makes a few changes here and there. He also will incorporate from that common source, the Q source, and then has his own unique source, which scholars call L. written the same time as Matthew, 80 to 85 AD, excuse me, in Asia Minor for Gentile Christians. So again, if we think of a map, you've got Mark writing his gospel in and around Rome. You have Matthew writing in Syria, just to the north of Israel, for Jewish Christians that lived in that area. And then you go further north, Asia Minor, kind of modern day Turkey or perhaps southern Greece, for a community of Gentile Christians. Again, non-Jewish Christians is the primary audience for Luke. If Luke were to be here right now and we were to ask him about what it means to be a disciple, his answer would be inclusion. Now, this for us today in the 21st century, where inclusivity is such a big buzzword, this is a revolutionary idea. And so Luke's gospel has often been described as the most revolutionary gospel because women are included. Jesus is interacting with Jews and Gentiles, Jews and Romans, Jews and Samaritans. That Jesus is a kind of Messiah who has come to save everyone, not just the people who identify with the Jewish tradition. So even from the opening pages of Luke's gospel, when you read his infancy narrative, his approach, while we might look at it today and not be kind of swayed or impacted by the revolutionary nature, clearly the fact that he's focusing on women, Mary, and to pause there, sorry if you heard my kids yelling in the background. But as I was saying that, we take it for granted with the 21st century worldview, looking at Luke's gospel, and we lose the sense of the revolutionary way that he kind of frames his gospel. But if we understand it from the perspective of a first century Jew or Gentile reading the gospel, the fact that in the opening pages of his gospel, the infancy narrative highlights the role of women, particularly Mary and Elizabeth, that is very, very, very much quite shocking and surprising, and that will continue throughout the rest of his gospel. Lastly, to set the stage for what you're reading, I wanted to comment briefly on the infancy narratives, or what we would call the Christmas stories. There are no infancy narratives in Mark or John's gospel. You can certainly open your Bibles and take a look at how those gospels begin. Mark's gospel, we'll see for next week, begins with Jesus already as an adult, ready to begin his public ministry. John's gospel begins with a prologue. John kind of sets up a kind of philosophical explanation of who Jesus is. He calls him the Logos, which is a Greek word that means logic or reason or order. And then again, it begins with Jesus already as an adult, ready to kind of assume his status as a public figure. It's only in Matthew and Luke's Gospels that we find birth stories of Jesus, and their birth stories are very, very different. Kind of what we have done over the years through history is take these two traditions of Matthew and Luke's and blend them into one story, what we celebrate today as Christmas. But kind of my hope is, as you read through those opening chapters that are assigned for this week, that you'll be able to do some of that redaction criticism that I've highlighted on the screen here. As you read and use that chart that kind of gets you to compare and contrast their two versions, you'll see how they devised an opening that really spoke to their primary audience. For Matthew, what ways in the gospel that he's going to show us in the early pages that Jesus is kind of a Jewish superhero. He's kind of this model Jew. And how in Luke's gospel that this Messiah is a universal Messiah who's coming to save everyone in a very revolutionary sort of way. So both Gospels use the introductions, their infancy narratives, to introduce us to the kind of Messiah Jesus is going to be. So that's kind of what I want you to watch for as you read through those opening chapters. Again, that chart on the infancy narratives worksheet will help you kind of break that down. If you really get stuck on a specific area, send me an email. Otherwise, don't forget to do your readings, to participate in the discussion board, as well as to take the online quiz by Friday at 6 p.m. Take care, guys, and talk to you soon.